Okay, I'm going to call the meeting to order. Sorry for the slight delay. I just had to confer with the treasurer about something. The City of London is committed to making every effort to provide for alternative formats, communication support for council, standing committee, and advisory committee meetings, and information upon request. To make a request for any city service, please contact accessibility@london.ca or 519-661-2489, extension 2425. Are there any disclosures of pecuniary interest from colleagues? Seeing none, I will note on the agenda we have two scheduled items, one not to be heard before 12:30, another involving interviews for Eldon House at 12:45. That's when the candidates are coming, so ideally we can land those. But just a note that there are a couple of timed items. We'll deal with everything else before those timed items if necessary, although one is now, so we'll be able to deal with that one when it comes. Consent items. Does anyone want to separate the two items for consent, deal with them separately, or can we put a motion together? Seeing no one wanting to separate them, we'll put up consent item 2.1 and 2.2, and I'll look to colleagues for any comments on those. Councillor Helmer.
Just briefly on 2.2, this is obviously good news for London. The colleagues who are on this committee will recall that just 2 years ago, we were receiving almost $1 million less in provincial gas tax funding than we are this year. So it's quite a significant increase. That's a combination of more money into the overall pot for gas tax funding, but also London getting a good share of that funding. That's partly driven by obviously the ridership growth that we've been seeing at London Transit. So that's a very positive story. It's $342,000 more than last year and $1 million more than 2 years ago. So that's very good. I wanted to say thank you to the provincial government for funding that. My understanding is that the gas tax funding is going to basically 92% of all municipalities, like all the population in the province, because most of the municipalities have public transit services that qualify for that funding.
Councillor Van Meerbergen.
Thank you. Also on 2.2, I have a question for staff. I'm wondering, is this funding completely earmarked for transit, or can you make the argument that it can also be used for roads, since roads are also part of the public transportation system?
Ms. Barbone, or?
Through the chair. So currently right now it is being used and allocated completely towards transit. I don't have the rules right in front of me to confirm how broad that category is, but typically there's a little bit of flexibility. It's just what the choice has been for that funding to date.
Yes, because more specifically, if you look at page 5 at the bullet points about the following purposes, if you look at point 1 and point 4, talks about public transportation capital expenditures, but clearly if the roads aren't improved, then the transit can't improve. So they kind of go hand in hand. So I was just looking to see if we can at least look at funding some road development with some of this.
Ms. Barbone.
Possibility?
We can certainly look at what the allocations are planned. I think right now the allocations are specific to what was already within the capital budgets, but we'll be looking at that as part of the 2020 budget development anyways. So it'll be an opportunity just to confirm.
Councillor Helmer.
Just briefly to give you a sense of the eligibility. So right now it's for transit capital or operating. That can include upgrading transit infrastructure, increasing accessibility of transit, purchasing transit vehicles, adding more routes, and expanded hours of service. So it's very focused on transit right now.
Councillor Van Meerbergen.
I'd like to thank the councillor for that. So what we can say then, since the roads are part of the transit infrastructure, that it could be used if we so desire.
Councillor Helmer.
I'm not aware of any municipalities that are doing that.
All right. Any further comments? And this is both consent items together. I just need a mover and a seconder. Moved by Councillor Van Meerwegen, seconded by, I'm happy to second it. We'll put that up on the screen for voting.
Closing the vote, the motion's passed 3-0.
Under scheduled items, we have the apportionment of taxes not to be heard before 12:30. We're past that time. I don't know if there's any staff information that's usually provided on this. I know we've dealt with it lots of times. If any new councillors or current councillors are looking for information, you can certainly ask. Otherwise, we can proceed through this. Go ahead. If you just want to provide maybe a brief intro to what we're doing, perhaps.
Yeah, through the chair, Jim Logan is going to give some information.
This is a report that's required by legislation. Whenever a property is divided and it has arrears of taxes, we are required to divide the arrears and have it approved by council. And usually, there isn't any issue about it because it usually is fairly straightforward. It's just a matter of dividing the value of the assessed property and dividing the payments.
Okay, any questions for our staff? Otherwise, I know this is not a public participation meeting, but we certainly usually invite any comments from the public on this, and I'll move to that if there are no technical questions from staff on this. Are there any members of the public who want to make comment on the apportionment of taxes? Seeing none. Then we can move to a mover and a seconder for the approval of this apportionment. Moved by Councillor Van Meerwegen, seconded by Councillor Helmer. Any discussion? Seeing none, we'll open that for voting as well.
Closing the vote, the motion's passed 3-0.
The next item is a item for direction from the London Convention Center for a request for, basically it's a letter. I'm sure everybody has read it. I know Ms. De Silva is here to answer any questions, or if the committee would like, we could have her talk about the request. I don't believe our staff have any comment on this at this time. If they do, they can signal to me. Otherwise, I'll look to committee members if you'd like to hear from Ms. De Silva on this this letter that the Convention Center has written. Is that a yes? We would love to hear from you about the letter that you've written.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to come and speak to you today. As the letter indicated, we are in the process of upgrading our second floor. It hasn't been done since 2009, and we're really focusing on moving the color scheme and the feel of the first floor into that second floor. The space has been put out of order, and so we aren't taking any business on that floor from I think it's about the second week in July through till the second week in September. So we're hoping to do as much renovation as possible. Because we have to replace the roof on the building this year, that's about $2 million out of our capital reserve. We're left with $1 million to complete the second floor renovation, which was pre-approved in a prior capital year. And so we're looking for some additional funding so we can do a little bit more than just what that $1 million will cover. I actually brought along, just to give you a highlight as to what's happened this year, our direct economic impact in 2018 is about $21.3 million, which is the highest economic impact we've tracked in the last decade that I've been there anyway. And certainly our building utilization rate is up to 74%. That's basically the days the building is open with some sort of function going on. So it's not a unit square foot usage, it's really somebody's in the building with an event going on. And we've broken down the proposed second floor renovation so you can get a better idea. We've got about 10 weeks to complete this. We're not looking at structural changes, it really is cosmetic. And $1 million will really cover upgrading our operable partitions. Those are those movable walls that you see. We have to replace about 6 track areas, and we're replacing the panels that have pocket doors. So there's 7 doors that we're replacing, revinyling those walls as well. And we're looking to paint and replace carpet in both the foyers and the main ballroom. That, with some contingency and consulting fees, is about $1 million. With some additional funding, we feel we'll be able to replace the acoustic wall panels in the ballroom. That's sort of the upper part of the ballroom. The lower part is stone wainscoting, which we're hoping not to replace. We're hoping just to refurbish it. But we'd really like to put some new entrance doors from the pedway into the London Convention Centre. And that's an additional about $500,000. So that's where we come with the 1.5. Our bigger picture vision is about $3.5 million. And that includes a lot of ceiling upgrades, lighting upgrades, and certainly replacing the stone in the foyer and doing some different things like that, which we know we can't get done in the 10 weeks, and it's a healthy budget to tackle in 1 year.
Questions from colleagues? Councillor Van Meerbergen.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm just wondering why this wasn't part of the general budget process. Like, why are we doing this outside of the main budget?
Ms. De Silva.
Through the chair, we're actually thinking that we would be not in a position to ask for additional funding at this point in time, because we were hoping that the funding would be coming through the municipal accommodation tax. But in the past month, we've realized that that fund is being utilized, and so we thought there might be an opportunity to secure some additional funding through that opportunity and be able to apply it right away this summer.
If I could, one more.
Yeah, go ahead.
You mentioned on page 22.5, limited arrival appeal from the DoubleTree by Hilton. So what is it specifically that will mitigate that in terms of this ask?
Go ahead.
Through the chair, we're actually looking just to replace the doors from the pedway into the second floor. So it's a small step in terms of improving that. Since that initial consulting report was done, we've also put a giant mural inside the pedway, and we are looking to revamp the King Street Park area so that exterior space, we'll start working on that in future summers, and you'll see that taking place.
Okay, no further questions from Mrs. Silva. Thank you for the presentation. I wouldn't go anywhere because we might have other questions that will arise. So this is a letter from that's on our agenda without any direction attached. Certainly at this time, if you need to ask questions of our staff to help you craft some sort of recommendation, we should deal with the letter in some way. So I'll be looking to committee members for their thoughts on this. I'm going to let Councillor Helmer, and then I'll come to you. Councillor Helmer.
Yeah, through the chair, to our staff, this is obviously not the first request we've had for the tourism infrastructure reserve funds. I know that there's kind of a bit of a pressure on the existing balance of the fund, and we're not really sure because we don't have a lot of history about where it's going. So in terms of a conservative estimate of where you think the reserve balance will be around the time that there might be draws on it, can you give us some sense of where you think it's going, given the timing of what Mrs. Silva's been proposing?
Thank you. Through the chair. So now that we've had a little bit more time elapse, we've been trying to look at and calculate the revenue we have to date from the last 3 months experience of 2018. So we are actually in process of working through a report to bring forward to the next corporate services that will provide a bit of an update on this for council and committee to have a look at this. And as well, there is another request that we have that will be coming forward that we've been asked to bring forward. So based on that, what we're projecting, assuming that the 2019 Juno Awards request will be paid in 2019. That is subject to budget deliberations next week. We're essentially estimating approximately a $1.5 million city share and contribution annually at this point, based on very limited experience into the infrastructure reserve fund. So after the Juno Award of the $150,000, assuming that is approved by council next week, we're estimating we'd have approximately $1.7 million after that for the end of 2019. So these are very preliminary estimates at this point, but this is our best estimate as to what we think will be in that reserve fund by the end of the year. And then going forward, we're looking at the additional amounts that are 2.7 potentially by the end of 2020, which is the London Children's Museum.
Good? Okay, go ahead. Councillor Cassidy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for recognizing me at your committee. I actually do have a question for Ms. De Silva. And the basically 1.5 million that you need for all of these projects combined over the summer of 2019. My guess is that those projects would be staged, and so you have $1 million in the capital reserve fund that you'll be using, and then the 500,000 from the MAT funding. So it's conceivable that the 500,000 could come closer to the end. That funding could come closer to the end of the project, and therefore give the infrastructure reserve fund a chance to build up. Is my assumption correct?
Go ahead.
Through the chair, that would be correct. We will certainly use the funds that we have available to us first and foremost out of the reserve. And this project will be running right into the early parts of September. So I would certainly final payments wouldn't be made till after that 30-day sort of warranty review after that.
I actually have a couple questions. I'm going to hand the chair over to Councillor Helmer for this part. On this, I guess our question is maybe for our staff, and let me just preface it with, when I look at the request, I get the idea of taking advantage of the time, the downtime that is there to make some other improvements. The presentation started off by emphasizing the economic impact that the convention center has. And I'll tell you, I'm very hesitant myself to expend any more money out of the Municipal Accommodation Tax Reserve Fund until we have established parameters around how we're going to deal with that fund. Are we going to be having a certain amount annually? Are we going to be saving for multi-year projects? That being said, there does seem to be a strong economic development component to this ask, and I wonder if I can ask our treasurer whether the economic Development Reserve Fund is perhaps a more appropriate source of financing to consider for this particular request than the municipal accommodation tax.
Thank you, through the chair. So one of the things we did after reading the letter from the Convention Center was look if council wished to support this, if there were alternate funding sources. So the Economic Development Reserve Fund is a potential funding source, although there is another one that would be appropriate in the situation, and that there is money that has been unallocated, is from our Federal Gas Tax Reserve Fund. And there is a component of that is specific for convention centers and facilities, and it would qualify as well. So those either source would be appropriate, and there would be money in either fund to accommodate this request.
Okay. Stemming on that stream, and I want to just touch on the municipal accommodation tax again for a moment. Again, my hesitancy in expending this money till we have some parameters around it, so I like the idea that there are potential other sources of financing to accommodate this request. The treasurer mentioned that there's a report coming forward on the municipal accommodation tax, and I was going to circulate a motion to my colleagues under additional business to pause the expenditure of money from that fund, but my understanding is that that might be addressed in the report that's coming forward through a discussion that we had. Could you elaborate on that for me so I understand?
Through the chair. So in in preparation for this other request that has been identified for us, we wanted to provide an update on the municipal accommodation tax. So we're working on a continuity schedule and to show exactly the funds that are coming in and provide an update on the funds that are coming in and what council has committed to date after the budget deliberations will occur next week. So in preparation for that, we're looking at trying to develop a process, and we've started working on that, but it's going to take a little bit of time to fully develop a couple of different options for council to vet through. So our intent in bringing forward this next report is to provide a full update on the municipal accommodation tax, as well as this additional request that has been brought to our attention to bring forward to the committee. And I think after that, what we were going to suggest was that we may, to give us time to develop a process, and so that council doesn't have a number of requests that continue, that you may wish to possibly defer until such time in the future. And that would also give us a little bit better confirmation of what experience we have in this reserve fund. One of the things we try not to do is to pre-commit expenditures from a reserve fund that haven't yet been earned. So that's one of the practical things that we've tried in our philosophical policies to try to stick towards. So in this case, because it's new and we don't have the experience, we do have some high-level estimates, but of course, if they could be higher, they could be lower. So having some experience would give council a sense of how you wish to potentially allocate those funds going forward.
So the reason why I'm asking this, and the reason why I'm dwelling on the municipal accommodation tax fund is it's a source that was identified in the report. Maybe not the only source to deal with the request, and I'll talk about the request in a second. But I do think that it's incumbent on us to ensure that we're setting some clear parameters around the expenditures of those funds. Again, I was going to bring forward a motion today to pause that, given the report coming forward will address that in some way, and I don't want to preclude anything that's in the pipe. I'm going to wait until that report comes forward to provide any additional direction on that piece, because again, I don't think that we should be expending any more money from that fund until we really have a clear understanding on how we're going to allocate that fund on a annual or multi-year basis, and make sure we have a clear understanding on the inflows into that fund. Given that, I'm not going to support anything that colleagues come up with today that expends the municipal accommodation tax for this request. However, given the other items that were identified by the treasurer as potential sources of funding, I would be willing to either get some information back on our staff or proceed with the discussion and entertaining the idea of funding the request from those sources of funding, particularly if there's a source from the federal gas tax that is identified for convention center facilities. That seems much more appropriate to me to help, because I do get the idea of taking advantage of the downtime. We certainly don't want to create an issue with the economic impact of the organization by having multiple downtimes. And if there's a case to be made that this is going to enhance the ability of the facility to rent space and have a top level experience for convention goers in the city, then I'm willing to support that, but from a source of financing that is appropriate for the ask. So those are my comments for the committee, and I'll let other colleagues debate on this as well.
Okay, I have Councillor Van Meerbergen and then Councillor Cassidy. I'll turn the chair back over to Councillor Morgan.
Well, I just wanted to comment on the points made by the treasurer. I think this is very positive. I think what you're saying makes a whole lot of sense. My feeling is that the accommodation tax reserve fund has been spent 10 times over already. My suspicion is, and my hunch is that there are lots of organizations lining up to get a piece of it. So I think it makes some sense in terms of what you were commenting on earlier. So yeah, that's basically my comment for now.
Councillor Cassidy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Speaking again to your committee. I understand the reticence of going to the municipal, or the Tourism Infrastructure Reserve Fund when it's so new. I want to remind colleagues that were around when we approved the tax that the convention center and the renovations that they recently went through were presented as a prime example of how we could use this fund. So here we are with the convention center coming forward with a need, and I'm fully supportive of it. I would be very supportive of any motion that says we will commit to this funding, and there are two possible sources of funding this request, and we'll decide the actual final source at some later date. I would be completely supportive of that. I would really like to see the Tourism Infrastructure Reserve Fund as the one that's at the top of the list. I didn't support the Juno ask. It didn't, in my opinion, and I know we might be tied for the losing side on this. But I don't believe that it fit the criteria that we set out. We wanted permanent infrastructure. Example given to us was the convention center and the kind of renovations that they went through. As far as the downtime goes, this is taking advantage of a time when the ballroom will be unavailable for functions because the roof's being done. I know that July and August are less used, it's a time when it's lower utilization. However, I know 2018 also was this amazing year, and so I think there were times in the year when we would have expected lower utilization, and we had a lot of functions booking the convention center, and so we had a really great year in 2018, and so I would hate to lose opportunities like that. I would hate to have an extra period of time when the convention center is offline to do these renovations, and it could be available for a last-minute booking of some kind. So I'm supportive of the ask. I prefer it to come from the Tourism Infrastructure Reserve Fund, but I will look at other sources if that's the will of council.
Councillor Helmer.
I'm going to see what happens here. I'm going to suggest that we approve the funding request from the Tourism Infrastructure Reserve Fund, $500,000. You know, one of the reasons I asked about the sort of balance and where we think it's going is I don't want to overcommit money, but considering the timing of the project, the starting balance of the fund, what we've already approved, which is just the Juno request for 2019. That there may be a Children's Museum impact out in 2020, but that's not in 2019. It looks like we're talking about probably, if nothing else happens, the balance would be $1.6 million or something at the end of the year, or $1.2 million, you know, like maybe a little bit less than that if this other request is granted. So I think that's quite reasonable, you know, even if we're talking about the expenditures starting in the summer, you know, they're probably not going to get paid out for a while, and it's not as though we will be spending money we literally do not have. So especially considering that some of the project is from a separate reserve fund, you spend that money first and come to the Tourism Infrastructure Reserve Fund at the end. You know, I think there's plenty of room there. I do think any future requests are starting to get to the point where it's going to be a real problem, and the specific timing of those requests and when they're going to be draws on the fund, that's an important part. And I think that's the part that we're missing. We do have a very clear purpose for the Infrastructure Reserve Fund, the Tourism Infrastructure Reserve Fund. I agree with Councillor Cassidy that this is very well suited for that. And you think about all the hotel operators who are paying the tax from their revenues on their hotel night stays. This is exactly what they wanted to see happen, was investments like this in the convention center, which is very related to their business. So, you know, I support that. I know that the federal gas tax money could be used for this. It's also eligible for 18 other categories of things, including wastewater infrastructure, water infrastructure, public transit, all kinds of things. I prefer to use that fund for things that we can't use Tourism Infrastructure Reserve Fund money for. Yeah, we can't use Tourism Infrastructure Reserve Fund, for example, for like brownfield redevelopments or airport investments. You know, that's probably not going to fly. So, you know, the public, the gas tax fund from the feds is a bit more flexible than the Ontario gas tax fund, and I'd like to keep it that way if we can, and sort of last resort, I would suggest. The balance in that fund I don't think is super high either. It was higher. It's a bit lower now, and I'm not sure we want to be committing too many draws to it either, considering what it could be called on.
So Councillor Helmer wants to make a motion to support the request up to $500,000, I believe, from the Tourism Investment Reserve Fund. Is there a seconder? Okay, there's no seconder. Alternate motions. Councillor Van Meerbergen.
Well, I think we, rather than commit right this moment, given the arguments we've heard already, that we maybe request the civic administration be directed to defer any requests for funding from Tourism Infrastructure Reserve Fund until such time as the civic administration has reported back and municipal council has approved a process for processing such requests and has determined how funds from the reserve fund are to be allocated. And maybe we could add to that in the case of this particular ask, other appropriate reserve funds that may or may not be equally suited to funding this request.
Do you think we could separate those two into different components? One is about the tourism, so let's deal with this funding request first. We just said no to funding it from that source. So I'd be happy to hand the chair over and propose a motion unless you have another one. You're on the list right now. Okay, I'll hand the chair to Councillor Helmer. So I'm going to suggest that we support the ask from the Economic Development Reserve Fund, actually, because I think that economic development suits very well with this, given the economic impacts of the organization. I know that that fund as well has a balance in it, and I would support a similar motion to what Councillor Helmer said, but using the Economic Development Reserve Fund as the backstop. I was okay with the gas tax and this one. I actually appreciate the comments about all the things that we could spend the gas tax money on. I was comfortable with both at the start, and the reason why I suggest that is not because this could fit with the Tourism Investment Reserve Fund, but I am very hesitant to expending that money because what we don't know is all of the other great things that will come forward from all of the other organizations in the city that will fit that fund very well. And I've grown to the point where I'm uncomfortable expending that money until I see both the size, volume, and number of asks that may fit very well for that fund, particularly when there are other appropriate sources of financing to allow the project to proceed as is. So that would be my motion, is to proceed to allow for this to be expended from the Economic Development Reserve Fund as the source of financing.
Can I just ask staff, how much is available in the Economic Development Reserve Fund? Do we have an indication of that?
Through the chair, the projected 2019 ending balance is about $16 million.
Thank you.
Any further discussion? Okay, so we have a motion from Councillor Morgan, which is to approve the request, but $500,000 from the Economic Development Reserve Fund. I think rather than playing musical chairs with the chair, I'm just going to make my comments on the motion from the chair before I turn back over to Councillor Morgan. I'm frankly a bit surprised that we're having the discussion around, what is the most appropriate source of financing for this. I have perhaps been a little too reasonable in my comments so far, so I'm going to be a little bit less reasonable. So the principle I'm trying to follow is that if tourism can pay for tourism, excellent. So the Economic Development Reserve Fund and the Federal Gas Tax Reserve Fund, both taxpayer-supported reserve funds. One is from federal taxpayers, the other one is from property taxpayers. So the contributions that go into the Economic Development Reserve Fund are from property taxpayers. I would like to, if we can, pay for tourism infrastructure using tax revenues that come from tourists. So I don't know why that's a difficult thing. It seems like a difficult thing to advocate for. I thought this was the whole purpose of the Tourism Infrastructure Reserve Fund. This is very clearly a tourism-related expenditure, capital infrastructure. The only argument that I find persuasive at all is that the balance might be under threat, because we're allocating some money before we've got a full year of collections underway. We don't have a process for handling any requests from capital funding for any of these reserve funds, really. And so we're talking about, well, maybe we should use this one or maybe we should use that one. I mean, if we start doing that, we might start getting a lot more requests for capital funding through the reserve funds outside of the budget process. I'm not sure we really want to encourage that. I do think we're going to have lots of requests for the Tourism Infrastructure Reserve Fund because it's new, because there isn't an established process, and because there's lots of tourism infrastructure that needs to be built. I'm fine with managing through that process, especially given that the staff are gonna be coming back with a report about that, and I think that's a really important issue. But on the principle of like tourism should pay for tourism, I'm very uncomfortable with the idea of using an economic development reserve fund that's taxpayer supported when we can use, and I think should use, the Tourism Infrastructure Reserve Fund. So I'm gonna vote against the Economic Development Reserve Fund, which, you know, in the absence of a Tourism Infrastructure Reserve Fund, would be a fine source of financing for this kind of thing. And it's a bit of an odd situation to be in, to say, oh, I'm not gonna support it, but I'm gonna vote against it.
Okay. So I move that, so Councillor Helmer, I would prefer if you could chair the part where we line up a seconder, so I'm not lining up my own seconder.
Sorry, I thought you had a seconder, Councillor Van Meerbergen?
I'll second.
Yeah.
So now let's move in and seconded. Councillor Cassidy, comments?
As a guest of the committee, would it be appropriate to separate out the motion so that Councillor Helmer may be inclined to support part of it but not the other? If you say support the funding ask from tourism or from the convention center up to $500,000, and then a B part could be that the source of funding be X, Y, or Z. That's just a suggestion.
I would be happy to do that if that's what Councillor Helmer would like to do. Yes, right now we have a moved and seconded motion to fund the request. However, the source of financing is from the Economic Development Reserve Fund. What we seem to be is everybody agrees in supporting the request. Good news for you. We have some disagreement on the appropriate source of financing and the reasons for that. So Councillor Cassidy has suggested that might be advantageous. It's probably going to come up at council. I just want to see if Councillor Helmer would like to separate it into supporting the request and then source of financing. And if he doesn't, that's fine. We can vote on it the way we want, but that's what Councillor Cassidy suggested. So Councillor Van Meerbergen, you still have the floor, then I'll go to Councillor Helmer.
So we also have the motion about asking staff to come back with.
Let's do that one second, if we
Okay,
can.
okay. We're going to wait with that? Okay.
Yeah.
So I appreciate where Councillor Cassidy is coming from. Unfortunately, I'm not gonna support, well, I approve it with no source of financing. So no.
So it'll all be together, and obviously there can be a debate at council about that as well. So moved and seconded to support the request from the Economic Development Reserve Fund. Any other debate or discussion? Okay, we're about to open something for voting, so let me just recap where we are. We're voting on, I'm about to open the voting on a moved and seconded motion to support the request from the London Convention Center up to $500,000 to be funded from the Economic Development Reserve Fund. There's some discussion that the committee was having about the appropriate source of financing. We had a motion that didn't get seconded to fund it from the Tourism Investment Reserve Fund, but right now we're about to vote on a motion from the Economic Development Reserve Fund for the tourism ask. I haven't opened the motion yet, so if you're looking to speak, Mr. Mayor, since you showed up, I'd be happy to allow that.
With apologies, Chair. So there wasn't a seconder for the motion, is that what you said?
There was no seconder for a previous motion on to use the source of financing for the Tourism Investment Reserve Fund. What we do have is a moved and seconded motion for the same request with a source of financing from the Economic Development Reserve Fund.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to open the voting.
I vote yea.
Closing the vote, that motion is passed, 3-1.
Okay, the next two items on the agenda are in-camera items. However, we have deferred matters and additional business. So Councillor Van Meerbergen, this is where if you wanted to move an additional motion that you could.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think it's appropriate that, given the interest in this fund, that the Civic Administration be directed to defer any requests for funding from the Tourism Infrastructure Reserve Fund until such time as the Civic Administration has reported back and Municipal Council has approved a process for processing such requests and has determined how funds from the Reserve Fund are to be allocated.
Okay, that's moved. Is there a seconder for that? Mr. Mayor.
I'll second for discussion.
Okay, moved and seconded. Discussion. Councillor Helmer.
In the absence of the information that was provided earlier in the meeting around the fact that we're going to have a report at our next meeting on this same topic, it just seems like it's not necessary. So I don't want to tie something up for no reason. If we're going to have a report on this issue at the next meeting, let's just wait for that report.
I'm going to put myself on the speaker's list. Yeah, so I know that I drafted the motion that I circulated. I'm not actually supporting it at this time, mainly because I've made my points, and in the treasurer's answer, this is actually going to be dealt with in a report coming to our next corporate services meeting. And so I think I'm going to wait to see what their comments are and the recommendations around that, rather than presuppose those, which is why I'm not going to support it at this time. Councillor Van Meerbergen.
So maybe I can just get that confirmed. So basically what we're looking for is coming back. I wasn't quite clear on that. So that is coming back the next meeting?
Ms. Barbone.
Through the chair, we're actually just completed the report, and it'll be submitted on Friday. So it has another request that's been brought forward to our attention, but what we're doing is bringing an update on the revenue that's been earned to date based on the 3 months experience that we have to the end of December, as well as a full continuity of what our estimates are in flowing into the reserve fund and the share that would go to tourism as well. And then there'll be a little bit of background on the recommendations that we're working on to start to put a process together that we would report back with a process for council's consideration in the late spring.
And I'm happy to withdraw the motion.
I think it's very clear that since there's no meeting between now and then, we're going to get this information. At that time, we could provide additional direction if we felt the need be. So motion withdrawn. Any other additional business or deferred matters? None? We have two in-camera items, 6.1 and 6.2 listed on the public agenda. Given that there's nothing else on the public agenda, I think when we go into camera, we'll adjourn from the committee room. So I'd look for a motion to go in camera for those two items. Councillor Helmer, Mr. Mayor, moved and seconded. We'll do that on the screen.
Closing the vote, that motion's carried 4-0.